can't change the system, right? And if he can't change it, why does John Doe think he can change it, right? So systemic changes aren't done by individuals. Systemic changes are done by enormous, well-mobilized, well-equipped bodies, structures that are far beyond the possibilities for any individual who is oppressed by that system. So what Wes wants to do in the next session is to go beyond liberalism and conservatism, right? We need to go beyond just simply parroting this liberalist conservatist viewpoints, right? This is like the MSNBC versus Fox viewpoint, right? MSN will always talk about the liberal structuralist approach, right? Here's how everybody's being oppressed, let's change the system. Fox will say, oh, look at these people, they fail to work hard for themselves, and And both points are characterizations of the real problem. The real problem is far more profound than sort of this, diluted polemic discourse. So, with respect to going beyond this, we need to go beyond both the liberal and structuralist accounts now. The first thing to recognize is that structures and behavior are inseparable. This is exactly what I was saying, and this is what Wes says, right? Behavior is shaped in part by larger socioeconomic circumstances, right? Our behavior, the way we act, is shaped by larger socioeconomic circumstances. And the question is, well, what in the world does that mean? There's an actual theory, and it's known as social determinism. So the social determinists will say that our behavior, our actions, are in part shaped by our socioeconomic surrounding. So it's pretty obvious if you're a ghetto kid, you live in a very, very impoverished community, your grandfather was a felon, your father was a felon, your cousins and your older brothers were all felons, and obviously the community that you live in is impoverished, it is likely that you will become a felon, right? That your behavior, prior to even your birth, in a sense, has been determined by your social surroundings, right? So if I live in an area where there is a high felonization rate among African American men between, let's say, 18 and 30, and I find myself in that area, and I've satisfied the demographic requirements, being an African American man and so on, sheer peer pressure is going to involve and implicate me at some time in my life, right? So that social determinism suggests that there is a relationship between my socioeconomic conditions and the behaviors that follow. Now, this is not to say that this is always the case or necessarily the case. I came from impoverished communities, and I didn't follow that path, but I know the measures that I needed to take not to follow that path, and I know how many more of my friends and my acquaintances from my youth have been incarcerated and are dead, right? Quite a few of them died before I turned 18. Lots of them died before I turned 18, right? So, what he's saying is true, right? There is a sense in which social structures shape the way that we behave. It's important that we recognize the influence that these social structures have on determining or potentially determining our behavior, because we can attempt to modify. And this is what I'm going to do in my contribution to my community throughout my lifetime, is to try and allow young people to recognize how those social factors influence our behavior. Because if they can recognize, wow, that's influencing how I behave, right? Maybe the music I'm listening to, or maybe my friends, or whatever it might be, is influencing the way I behave, then if you don't want to end up like this, in this deterministic manner, you need to make, impactful changes in your life. So that's important. The next point, number 2, is that we must recognize the influence of cultural structures, right? It's not just political and economic structures that influence our behavior, right? It's not just political and economic structures that's going to influence the way in which we identify ourselves collectively within any social demography, right? Culture is an important aspect, right? Culture is an important structure. is an important, right? Culture is an important structure. There's no denying it, right? Culture has a huge influence on how individuals behave, and what we need to do is identify the culture and the role of culture. The last thing that he says, in going beyond this, is we have to address despair. Right? For Cornel West, despair is important. We need to, as a community, address the despair, the overwhelming despair felt by members of the African American community, if we're to go beyond the habitual felonization, criminalization of members of the population. Now, as you should be thinking, and maybe not, but I'll introduce the idea to you. In the beginning of this series on theories, I began with this notion of revisionist history. There is a sense in which you can link what Winnett said with what West said with this notion of revisionist history, because if we collectively revisit our historical understanding of slavery within the United States, there is a sense in which revisiting and maybe apologizing for and amending whatever open wounds might still exist might be what the African American community needs to go on. It might not be anything that complicated, right? It might just be a recognition that, yeah, you know, there was lots of strides that were made in the United States, but for example, when we talk about the New Deal and all the benefits that came from the New Deal, incorporated in that New Deal wasn't any benefits for African Americans because, you know, segregation was enforced, right? So that we have habitually been left out of all the big new deals and the big new benefits, right? And when it's for the majority, well, it's applauded. When it's for the minority, then it's condemned, right? So addressing that hypocrisy is essential. And if we can't address that hypocrisy, then the African American community is going to continue to be a nihilistic community, because we just know that it's not fair, right? And it's not us that, it's just like a mythos within the community. It's not fair. If members of the community feel that we're continually being denied recognition, we're continually being denied and acknowledged for our contributions, then the only social avenue that's typically left, and Freire talks about this, is violence. And later I'll talk about the use of violence, you know, either constructive uses of violence or disruptive uses of violence. As a peace theorist, it's very, very difficult to talk about violence. I don't think any black theorist does violence better than Frantz Fanon, but I'll save that discourse for later. So West says the nihilistic threat to its existence, right? Despair is the nihilistic threat to the existence of the black community. And he talks about psychological depression, personal worthlessness, social despair, and so on and so on. So for West, he wants to address the notion of despair within the black community. Okay, this notion of despair, however, isn't specific to the black community. And for me, I've done quite a bit of work, and I'm always studying. And to be honest with you, the thing that I'm probably most interested now, theoretically, is Chicano Studies. You know, I'm in no sense an expert in Chicano Studies, but there is a sense of kinship in the plight of black Americans, or black people as such, if you want to use the label black, and not specifically Hispanic theory or Hispanic studies, but specifically Chicano, right, or Chicana, right? The Chicana experience is a very important experience, because for me, as a young academic, I see sort of the black guy, the Mexican guy, and the Arab, the young Arabic guy, as being, we're the bad guys, right? We're the forces of evil in the world, right? We're the boogeyman. We're the people that you want to hide your daughters from. We're the guys that force you to walk on the other side of the road, right? So there is a sense in which there is kinship in this bizarre turn of events, right? So I have to give voice to the Chicano